The air inside the New York Summit Hall was thick with tension. Delegations from across the globe were gathered for what was billed as a global strategy forum, but everyone knew it was really about influence, who held it, and who was losing it. At the front row sat Donald Trump, leaning back in his chair with that familiar mix of arrogance and showmanship. Across the aisle, Ibrahim Traoré adjusted the cuffs of his uniform, his face calm, eyes steady. The two men had never shared a stage before, and the anticipation in the room was electric. Cameras zoomed in, journalists whispered into microphones, and aides hovered at the edges, ready to spin whatever happened next. The moderator's voice echoed, "Mr. Trump, Mr. Traoré, the question is simple, who will lead the next decade?" Trump leaned toward his mic, flashing that practiced smirk. "You can't win without us," he said, the "us" hanging in the air like a declaration of ownership. His voice carried the weight of decades where America dictated the terms, where leaders lined up for approval. Some in the audience chuckled, others shifted uncomfortably. Traoré's posture didn't change, but his gaze locked on Trump. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lean in, instead, he let a beat of silence stretch long enough for the smirk to fade slightly. "Then prepare to lose." The room froze. The words were simple, but the challenge inside them was seismic. A few African delegates broke into quiet applause, others held their breath, sensing that the conversation had just crossed from polite diplomacy into open confrontation. Trump leaned back, squinting at Traoré like a man trying to decide whether to laugh or bare his teeth. Outside the hall, social media lit up. Hashtags trended within minutes. Memes popped up showing Trump's smirk on one side, Traoré's calm stare on the other. Analysts whispered about the moment, a possible turning point in the balance of influence between Washington and a rising wave of African leadership. But inside the room, neither man looked away. This was no longer about a forum, or even about policy. It was a battle for narrative, and neither intended to blink first. The moderator tried to smooth over the tension, shifting to a prepared question about economic partnerships, but the atmosphere had already changed. What had been a forum of diplomatic platitudes was now a battleground of egos and visions. Trump leaned forward again, eager to reassert dominance. "Let me tell you something," he began, his voice rising. "When America invests, countries grow. When America steps back, chaos takes over. We've built roads, fed nations, protected peace. Without us, you're just noise on the global stage." The statement was met with polite applause from a few Western delegates, but Traoré's face didn't even twitch. Instead, he slowly removed his earpiece, as if he wanted to hear every syllable without the filter of translation. Then, leaning slightly toward the microphone, he spoke in a tone both calm and cutting. "For decades, you built roads, to take resources out. You fed nations, with food that made them dependent. You protected peace, as long as it protected your interests. If you call that leadership, then maybe the world needs less of it." A murmur swept through the hall. The African and Latin American delegations exchanged knowing looks. The European diplomats glanced at one another, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment burn itself out. Trump's jaw tightened. This wasn't a leader asking for aid or playing the role of a grateful partner. This was a man refusing to acknowledge American supremacy, and doing it publicly. He reached for his notes, flipping to a page marked in bold, ready to hit back harder. "You talk big," Trump fired, "but when the storms hit, when the markets crash, when your people are starving, who do you call? You call us. And we always answer." Traoré allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "We're learning," he replied, "so that we never have to make that call again." The words landed like a hammer, not shouted but planted deep. A few cameras zoomed in, catching the brief flash in Trump's eyes, a recognition that this man across from him wasn't bluffing. The moderator shuffled papers nervously. The line between discussion and duel had been crossed, and everyone in the room knew it. Trump straightened his tie, his signature grin replaced with a tighter, more defensive expression. For a man who prided himself on controlling the room, the sensation of being challenged without flinching was unfamiliar, and it was irritating him. "You know," Trump said, leaning into the mic with that slow, deliberate tone he used when he wanted to cut deep, "I've met plenty of leaders from your part of the world. They talk a lot, they promise a lot, but when it's time to deliver, they're nowhere. Don't think you're any different." The words dripped with condescension, and a ripple of discomfort moved through the audience. A few aides glanced at each other. Trump had shifted from policy to personal insult. Traoré didn't raise his eyebrows, didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he clasped his hands on the table, leaned forward just slightly, and met Trump's gaze head-on. "You've met leaders who came here asking for something," he said. "I'm here telling you we don't need what you're selling." The simplicity of the statement cut sharper than any elaborate rebuttal. There was no aggression in his tone, just certainty. And certainty was something the cameras loved. Trump chuckled, but it was hollow. "Everyone needs America. You'll see. When you can't get your crops to market, when you need security, when your neighbors turn on you, you'll see who you call." Traoré shook his head slowly, as if Trump had just confirmed the very problem. "And that," he said, "is why we've been building our own markets, our own security, and our own unity. Not to avoid trouble, but to avoid calling you." The hall erupted into a mix of applause and low grumbles. African delegates clapped openly. A few Middle Eastern representatives nodded in silent approval. Trump sat back, crossing his arms. The fight had turned into something bigger than either man. It was now a live referendum on whether the old rules still applied. And in that moment, the world was watching to see which man would blink first. The moderator's attempts to steer the conversation back to collaborative opportunities were ignored. Trump leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze fixed on Traoré like a predator sizing up prey. "Let's be honest," Trump began, his voice louder now, "without alliances with countries like mine, you're stuck. We have the capital, the technology, the military. We've been running this game for decades. You think you can just step in and rewrite the rules? That's not how the world works." The statement carried weight, the weight of an empire accustomed to setting the pace. A few delegates shifted uneasily, knowing this was the kind of rhetoric that usually ended debates. But Traoré leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "The problem with your game," he replied, "is that it only works if the rest of us keep playing. We don't have to rewrite your rules. We just stop playing by them." It was a line designed to land, and it did. A hush spread across the hall. The idea of simply walking away from the established order, rather than fighting within it, unsettled the usual power players. Trump's eyebrows twitched. "That's a nice slogan," he shot back. "But slogans don't build roads, or feed people, or defend borders." Traoré's voice stayed calm. "Neither do threats. Yet you've been using them for decades and calling it diplomacy." The hall reacted audibly this time, a mix of applause and gasps. The cameras caught Trump's smirk faltering, just for a moment, before he forced it back into place. The moderator cleared his throat nervously. "Gentlemen, perhaps we can move to shared solutions." Traoré didn't wait for the question. "A shared solution starts with respect. And respect starts when you stop assuming the world can't function without you." That sentence didn't just hang in the air, it settled like a verdict. Trump's fingers drummed impatiently on the table, a small tell the cameras caught in high definition. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of steady, unshakable pushback, especially from someone who refused to be rattled. The applause that followed Traoré's last remark hadn't just bruised his ego, it had sent a message that the room's energy was shifting. "You talk about respect," Trump said sharply, "but respect is earned. We've built a system that works. Without our markets, your exports die. Without our protection, your borders crumble. Without our influence, you're just isolated." The words were meant to corner Traoré, to frame him as small without America's blessing. But Traoré didn't even blink. He took a slow sip of water, set the glass down with deliberate care, and locked eyes with Trump. "Isolation isn't our fear," he said evenly. "It's our shield. When you stop depending on someone, you stop being controlled by them. That's not isolation, that's independence." The sentence landed with precision. A murmur of approval rippled through African and Asian delegations, while some European diplomats sat rigid, sensing the ground beneath the old order shifting. Trump leaned back, crossing his arms tightly. "Good luck with that. You'll find out the hard way what happens when you turn your back on the people who've been helping you." Traoré tilted his head slightly, his tone still calm but laced with finality. "We're not turning our backs. We're facing forward. Maybe that's why you think we're walking away." The audience reacted again, this time louder, the applause more confident. The cameras panned to delegates whispering among themselves, their eyes fixed on Traoré like they were seeing a new contender on the global stage. Trump's smirk remained, but it was strained now. The cracks in the armor were showing, and the man across from him knew exactly where to press next. Trump straightened his papers, the familiar rhythm of his voice returning, louder, more forceful, aiming to reclaim the room. "You think this is a game, Traoré? Let me tell you something, when America wants something done, it gets done. We've reshaped continents, toppled regimes, and kept order where chaos would have reigned. You don't lecture us about independence." The words echoed like a warning shot. Delegates exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer subtle posturing, it was open assertion of dominance. Traoré leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. His tone didn't rise, but every word carried weight. "And maybe that's the problem. You've been reshaping continents like they were pieces on a board, without asking the people who live on them. You call it keeping order. We call it keeping people in chains." The hall erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs. Trump's expression tightened. He knew that every clap in that room was another chip away at the authority he was trying to project. "Chains?" Trump scoffed, shaking his head. "Without us, you wouldn't even have the stability to sit here and talk big." Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he let a small, almost imperceptible smile creep in. "Then maybe your definition of stability is the problem. We don't want a world that's quiet because it's afraid to speak." That line sliced through the tension like a blade. Several delegates leaned forward, their attention glued to Traoré. The cameras captured every subtle shift, Trump's jaw clenching, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, the flicker of recognition that his opponent was landing hits not with volume, but with truth. For the first time in the exchange, the air in the room felt heavier, not from Trump's presence, but from Traoré's control. Trump's voice grew sharper, the veneer of controlled confidence beginning to peel. "You talk like you've got it all figured out, but let's be real, you're a leader of a country most Americans can't even find on a map. You depend on aid, on trade routes we secure, on the stability we maintain. Without us, you're nothing but a speech in a suit." The insult was direct, intended to sting. A few gasps slipped from the crowd, and even the moderator shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer a debate over policy, it had crossed into open belittlement. But Traoré didn't react with anger. He sat still, letting the silence linger until it became uncomfortable for everyone else. Then, in a measured voice, he said, "If the size of a country decided its worth, then humanity would still be bowing to empires that no longer exist. And if your people can't find us on a map, maybe that says more about your education than about our significance." The hall erupted in applause, louder this time, carrying a tone of vindication. Delegates who had remained neutral began nodding openly. Trump tried to wave it off, forcing a chuckle. "Cute line. But cute doesn't build power." Traoré leaned in, his eyes fixed on Trump. "Power built on the belief that others are beneath you isn't power, it's insecurity dressed up in a flag." That struck a nerve. Trump's lips pressed into a thin line, the smirk gone entirely now. The room's energy had shifted, the weight of the exchange no longer tilted toward him. For the first time, it wasn't Trump dictating the pace, it was Traoré, letting each word settle like a gavel hitting wood. Trump's posture stiffened, his arms folding tighter across his chest. The confident showman was slipping, replaced by a man who sensed the audience slipping away with him. He raised his voice again, trying to drown out the shift. You think you're some kind of visionary? You're just riding a wave until reality hits. When your people run out of resources, when your neighbors turn on you, when the world stops paying attention, you'll come knocking on our door again. It was a threat wrapped as prophecy, delivered with the tone of someone who believed it inevitable. Traoré didn't blink. He let Trump's words hang in the air, then spoke slowly, deliberately. The difference between us, Mr. Trump, is that you see the world as a door you own. We see it as land we share. And if your door ever closes, we'll still have the earth beneath our feet. The hall murmured, the weight of the statement sinking in. Cameras zoomed in on Trump, whose jaw was tightening again. You can't run a nation on idealism, Trump shot back, almost spitting the words. And you can't run one forever on intimidation, Traoré answered without missing a beat. The applause was immediate, louder than before. Delegates who had been silent now clapped openly, their eyes fixed on Traoré with a mix of admiration and curiosity. The moderator, sensing the stakes, didn't interrupt. He knew this had become more than a scheduled debate. Trump's gaze hardened. He had been in countless battles of words, but rarely had an opponent left him with so little room to maneuver. And Traoré knew it. Every measured reply was another brick in the corner Trump was finding himself in. Trump leaned forward, his tone lowering into something almost conspiratorial, but edged with venom. You know what happens to leaders who challenge the United States? History doesn't remember them kindly. They either disappear, or they come back asking for help. It was meant to be the knockout, a reminder of America's reach, spoken like a man who had seen such stories end before. But Traoré only straightened his back and met Trump's gaze head-on. History doesn't remember those who kneel either. It forgets them entirely. The room went still. No shuffling papers, no murmurs, just the weight of the words echoing off the walls. Trump forced a laugh, though it landed awkwardly. You think you're rewriting the rules? Traoré's eyes didn't leave him. I'm not rewriting them. I'm tearing down the book you wrote for us without our consent. A wave of applause broke out, the kind that didn't fade quickly. Cameras panned to delegations from across Africa, Asia, and even parts of Latin America rising to their feet. Trump shifted in his seat, clearly irritated by the optics. He turned to the moderator, as if to move the discussion along, but the moderator simply gestured for Traoré to continue. The momentum was no longer Trump's to control. For the first time that night, the former president looked like a man who had thrown his hardest punch, and watched it get caught in midair. Traoré rose slightly in his seat, not out of aggression, but to make sure his words reached every corner of the hall. His tone was steady, his voice carrying the kind of quiet force that made people lean in rather than pull back. Mr. Trump, leadership is not about reminding others of your power. It's about reminding them of their own. You've spent a lifetime telling nations like mine what they can't do without you. But tonight, I'm telling you what we will do without you, and we will thrive. The applause began softly, then grew into a thunderous ovation. Cameras captured delegates standing, clapping, some even nodding with visible pride. The air was electric, the kind of atmosphere that would replay endlessly in headlines and clips. Trump sat back, his expression unreadable, but the strain in his jaw told the truth. He had come to this stage expecting to dominate, to put Traoré in his place. Instead, he had become the foil to a message that resonated far beyond the walls of the conference hall. Traoré took a final sip of water, set the glass down, and looked out over the crowd. The future does not belong to those who cling to control. It belongs to those who build without permission. And we are building. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for him, it was for the idea that the rules could change, that the old order could be challenged and replaced with something more just. As the applause roared on, Trump glanced toward his aides, but they didn't meet his eyes. This wasn't his moment anymore. It belonged to the man across the table, who had walked in as the underdog and walked out as the voice the world couldn't ignore. Tonight, we witnessed more than a clash of words, we saw a clash of worlds. One built on fear, the other on freedom. Donald Trump came with the weight of America's past dominance. Ibrahim Traoré came with the promise of a future built on self-reliance. And when the dust settled, it wasn't the loudest voice that won, it was the clearest. Traoré didn't just answer insults. He dismantled them. He didn't just defend his nation. He defined it. With every measured word, he reminded the world that respect isn't granted by power, it's earned by principle. And as the cameras cut and the applause echoed, one truth became impossible to ignore: the age of dependency is ending, and the era of standing tall has begun. Traoré didn't just speak for his people tonight. He spoke for every nation tired of kneeling. History will remember this moment, not because Trump was challenged, but because Traoré proved that even the loudest empire can be silenced by the quiet certainty of a leader who refuses to bow.